Hello class, my name is Miguel Gochi and today I will be discussing Chapter 11, Time, Manner, and Place. And while this chapter has 5 main topics to discuss, I will mainly be focusing on the first topic, which is free speech rights in public places. I'm sure most of us have heard or seen a protest on the news and question, are they allowed to do that there? Protesting isn't bad, but there are times when, where, and how the protest is taking place could become an issue. An example of a common protest we see and often question its effectiveness would be people protesting in the highways or streets, which end up blocking traffic and basically not letting the people pass. While this form of protest is bothersome, it's not something I'll be discussing about. Instead, recent events, as we all are experiencing right now, have stirred up protests in some states like Michigan, which was labeled Operation Gridlock, rallied by the Michigan Conservative Coalition during this quarantine, and I believe that this protest should not be protected by the First Amendment. During the Davis v. Massachusetts case in 1897, the U.S. Supreme Court would uphold the convictions of William F. Davis, not because of what he was saying, but because he didn't have a permit from where he was preaching. Since then, the government could be allowed to put regulations on streets and parks if the restrictions are content neutral, narrowly tailored, and have alternative channels of communication. So to explain what content neutral is, as defined by the Supreme Court, it means justified without reference to the to the content of the regulated speech. I'll explain a little bit more of that later on. Narrowly tailored meaning to serve a significant government interest, and creating alternative channels of communication, meaning having other options, basically. So basically, what I'm pretty sure what we all know is these stay-at-home regulations enforced by our government is during this pandemic is to lessen the spread of the COVID-19 virus by telling us to stay at home and to only go outside for essentials. And if you do have to go outside, you have to wear a protective face mask at all times, and you must be 6 feet away apart from each other. So these protests, Michigan, which start in Michigan took place in the state's capital, and these people were protesting were protesting about these stay-at-home regulations, saying that they want to go back to their jobs and they want the government to reopen their jobs because the economy, as we know it, isn't really doing good, and they fear that it will do worse if they don't get something done and go back to work. By doing so, they started protesting at the Capitol without any face masks. They were just walking around and giving out candy with their bare hands, and in doing so, they were completely not taking into account the regulations that was enforced by our government, and instead could pose a potential risk to other people by helping the spread of the COVID-19 take place, because this is exactly how COVID-19 spreads. But I guess they get to understand that. So a similar case to this would be Ward versus Rock against racism. This case happened in 1989, which involved the city of New York, New York Central Park, which had guidelines to use sound amplification equipment and a technician provided by the city that bands had to use. So the court ruled that this case was in favor of New York because these regulations that the New York enforced on these bands were content neutral because it applied to all groups. It was narrowly tailored to serve a specific government interest, which was excessive noise. So this means that the reason why we have this enforced is because the surrounding area, like the neighbors and the people walking around, could complain about it and could see it as a potential risk to them. And it's also they were also given alternative communication channels because they were not because they were just in control of the volume, but they were able to play the music however they wanted to play. Nothing could stop them playing their music. They just had to they just put a cap on their volume. So the Michigan protests during the stay-at-home quarantine should not be protected by the First Amendment because the government has given them fair regulation for them to follow that do not impede on their First Amendment rights. These stay-at-home regulations is content neutral because it applies to everyone to stay at home, not just them. It applies to everyone to stay at home and to lessen the risk of the COVID-19 virus to spread. It is narrowly tailored to serve a significant government interest, and this government interest is basically the lives of the people, because people's lives are at risk during this pandemic. And they were given alternative channels by just merely the protests weren't stopped. They were just all they had to do was just wear face masks and stay 6 feet apart. And I'm pretty sure this protest could have been protected by the First Amendment, but because they weren't doing that, and as well as impeding potential, they were also impeding ambulances from going into their hospitals by leaving their cars and trucks on the streets. And that to me seems like it's also endangering the lives of people, especially right now when everyone just is so at risk of catching that virus. If people continue to go outside and not be on these regulations and not practice them themselves. And that to me concludes my topic. Stay safe, everybody.